shifting my seat and squirming.
Okay. We're rolling. So, what is your name and how long have you lived in Ocean Beach?
My name is Frank Gormlie, and I've lived in Ocean Beach pretty much straight through since 1968.
You know what? I'm going to put this just a little bit this way. You don't have to worry about talking to the mic. Okay. We'll start over. Okay. What is your name and how long have you lived in Ocean Beach?
I'm Frank Gormlie, and I've lived in Ocean Beach since 1968.
And what brought you to Ocean Beach?
I grew up in the local peninsula. You might have to shut it off. Let me give her the bar.
Okay. Mama?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay. Sorry again. What is your name and how long have you?
I'm Frank Gormlie, and I've lived in Ocean Beach since 1968.
And what brought you to the Ocean Beach area?
I grew up in the area, went to local junior and senior high schools, and went to college in the area. And Ocean Beach attracted me back because I saw it as the Haight-Ashbury of San Diego, and I related to the counterculture which was growing up and centered in Ocean Beach.
And what types of things was the counterculture doing back in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s?
The counterculture, or the hippie movement, or whatever you want to call it, represented a number of things. It presented symbols, morals, norms that ran literally counter to the establishment and to the established views and norms and morals and styles. It represented long hair for men and pants and no bras for women, and new songs, new music, new symbols, but also new ideas on how to relate to fellow man and woman, and to nature, to the environment, to the rest of the world.
So basically this seems like a good thing. So was there any resentment towards this movement in Ocean Beach specifically? But now you're going to have to hold because there's a check coming in.
Was there any resistance to the counterculture? Well, in Ocean Beach there was some. There were more conservative, older folks who resented the young hippies, but also throughout the city, I think Ocean Beach represented the San Diego's Haight-Ashbury. It represented the center of the counterculture, the hippie land. Those who opposed hippies, those who resented what the new alternatives were presenting, those who basically swallowed the establishment's line on the Vietnam War and on what else was happening throughout society, didn't like hippies, didn't like the counterculture, didn't like the forms and shapes and new styles it represented.
What do you think brought the hippies and mini Haight-Ashbury to Ocean Beach?
Well, for a number of reasons, Ocean Beach grew to be a college and youth community in the 50s and early 60s, and I think as the youth changed, as the youth of San Diego became more involved in the hippie styles, Ocean Beach did, because it represented sort of the most wild college area in town.
So, what function did you have in Ocean Beach in the counterculture? Well, just kind of like name some things that you were involved with.
When I moved back to OB from university life at UCSD, I immediately saw myself as a community organizer, and I felt that the reasons for the Vietnam War and the reasons for racism had to be attacked at the community level, and I became involved in trying to organize Ocean Beach as a community, organize around certain issues like planning, like ecology, around human rights. And I started the OB People's Rag, became the OB Rag. It was a community newspaper that lasted for 5 years, very well supported from the community. We published 5,000 to 10,000 issues every 2 weeks. was involved in the community planning group, which worked with other community groups and established the first democratically elected planning board in the history of San Diego. A number of us organized the OB Human Rights Committee, which basically worked to stop the abuses that the police department were practicing on hippies, on young people in general. And we're quite successful in a number of areas in stopping, for example, the field interrogations that the police had a habit of practicing, and a number of other issues relating to police spying on community and citizen groups. There was an attempt to form alternative countercultural there was an attempt to form alternative countercultural institutions that would oppose or literally run counter to the establishment's institutions. For example, the OB Rag was an alternative to, of course, San Diego Union. People's Food Store was an alternative to Safeway and Mayfair. The Human Rights Committee was an alternative to the Chamber of Commerce. The Community Planning Group was an alternative to the local Peninsula Establishment Group, and so on and so forth. So, in essence, we tried to create an alternative community made up of alternative institutions that people in the community could then relate to and would not have to rely and depend on the more established and establishment institutions.
Do you think that the government and the police were maybe treating Ocean Beach unfairly, or the citizens of Ocean Beach unfairly, because hippies were there and they couldn't identify with their type of culture? Or?
I think the police and the government and politicians related to hippies, like much of the general population in San Diego, being a conservative town that it is, fostered that feeling amongst the politicians and the press, and vice versa. The press had been more friendly to people in OB. Maybe people throughout San Diego would be more friendly. On the other hand, I think hippies, the protests that were centered in Ocean Beach, represented again a threat to the establishment, to the conservative ways and thoughts of San Diego, especially San Diego's establishment. They pull the strings. The press works for the establishment. OB would never get much press, and when it did, it was quite the exception. Harold Keene, for example, from Channel 8 and San Diego Magazine made an attempt or two. But in the whole, OB has always been treated by the media as this far-flung, wild place full of hippies, drug addicts, potential terrorists, people who just don't get along with the system. And some in OB are proud of that and relate to that a lot, but I think on the whole, that people in OB grew to develop a sense of pride in their community, a sense of, the rest of San Diego wants to go its way, fine, OB will go its way, that we try to live our values, everyday values, in our everyday lives. And there's a tolerance here for different lifestyles, ages, creeds, colors. And I think one of the problems OB has had throughout its history is that it's been mainly an Anglo or a white community, and now that's even changing. But I think Ocean Beach became a bridge or a network of people who just saw themselves as trying to live a new lifestyle, live out new values, try to build alternatives in their lives. And of course now in the 90s, a lot of that's changed, but we still have a few institutions like People's Food Store around. Many of the teachers for the OB Free School are now teachers in San Diego city schools. And people, a lot of the activists here have become lawyers or union organizers or other organizers in other communities.
Had a blank. Can you tell me a little bit about the protests, the different, like the Jetty Project and the Collier Park? Can you go into detail about that?
You know the light is fading.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
I think it's okay.
Go. There were times when the community would come together and oppose something that was happening, put on by the city or the planning department or the Army Corps of Engineers. At one point in 1970, the city, the Army Corps of Engineers, the planning department, and working with some local establishment groups wanted to put in a jetty on the beach of Ocean Beach, and the community couldn't see why it was needed. Lots of rationales were raised for reasons to go ahead with the project, but the community still couldn't understand them, and thus, even as the work crews would be placing the large rocks that would make up the jetty, people at night, people from the community would come and dig holes and try to undo what the workers had done in the day. And those kinds of actions, plus legal actions, finally halted the building of this jetty that many people in the community saw as the first step in a series of steps that would bring Ocean Beach into a community of marinas, hotels, resorts, motels, nightclubs, a whole different community than it was, and it is. And a year or two after that, there was an attempt by the city to divide up parcel of land that was presented to the city back in the early parts of the century by the developer D.C. Collier, who gave a large portion of land to the children of San Diego. In the early 70s, the city planning department, the city council was basically trying to trade it to developers so they can develop the land into apartments. The community opposed that, and in early 1971, there was a demonstration that was actually against the Vietnam War, and also in protest the city dividing up this land. And through efforts from this community action, and with help from many other groups throughout the community, people were able to save Collier Park. It's now a small neighborhood park in northeast Ocean Beach. Those kinds of efforts are what we're talking about. In addition, in the mid-70s, there was a community planning crisis of Ocean Beach. Certain forces, economic forces, realtors, land developers, contractors, people who had huge financial stake in the community, made up a plan called a Peninsula Plan, and the Ocean Beach section of that called for the tearing down of the entire west end of Ocean Beach and allowing for literally the development of a whole resort end to the community. Hotels, marina, motels, nightclubs, the resort attractions that tourists would flock to, sort of a small Miami Beach. The crisis reached the proportions where many people from the community ganged together, formed a community planning group, lobbied with the city planning department, negotiated with the city council, Mayor Wilson at the time, and formed, with the help of other groups in Ocean Beach, the first democratically elected planning board in the history of San Diego, and thus were able to stop the horrendous effects and impact that this development would have caused for Ocean Beach. These are some of the victories I think that people can point to with pride that occurred in the 70s, the jetty, Collier Park, and saving OB from overdevelopment.
Do you want to go into any detail about the Collier Park incident? About what happened?
I can talk a little bit about it.
Just say that it was a peaceful demonstration, but
the Collier Park incident occurred when anti-Vietnam War protests at the beachfront developed and evolved into literally a movement of hundreds of people up Voltaire Street to this small section of land that was bare, but it had concrete chunks and glass throughout it. And our whole attempt was to go up there, clean up the park. A band was starting to set up. Food was being distributed for free. And it was just going to be a community carnival and an effort to actually clean up the park, get it ready to be a site for literally a park. The San Diego police arrived. They declared the assembly an illegal one because people were standing in the street. And even though the street was cleared, the police called for people to disband. Now you're talking about a huge group of people, 300 to 400 or 500 people with families, with babies, with grandparents, people holding plates of food. And it was just a ridiculous order. It was a peaceful gathering. Nothing was going on that was illegal or wrong or immoral. But the police came with the authority to disband this huge gathering of peaceful citizens and literally charged the crowd, pushing people out of the park down the street. And people of Ocean Beach just reacted and rebelled against this immoral abuse of authority. And fought against the police. They fought with sticks and stones and bottles. Ended up more than 50 people were arrested. A number of people were injured. I myself was arrested. Trying to pick up where I was.
Many people were arrested.
Many people were arrested. I saw a man who was beaten, unconscious, laying just on the ground. So there was a lot of abuses that occurred that day. But out of that came a momentum to save the park. And Collier Park today is a small neighborhood park in northeast OB. But it showed how, even though, despite the abuse of authority by government, people can still come together and get what they want and get what they need. And they do that by coming together and playing the political power game.
Do you think somehow like the developers were behind the police opposing this and going in because they wanted that park to build apartments or the big buildings on?
Well, I think the role of developers was indirect, but the presence was known because on that site there was the future stakes of a huge apartment complex that was coming in on part of what used to be Collier Park. And I think developers literally have ruled San Diego, have run the city council for generations and for decades. And only now, I think, are people in San Diego waking up to the fact that other people have a stake and should have a say in how San Diego is run. But developers in the mid-'70s definitely had a lot more influence even than they do today.
Okay. Blank again. Do you think maybe that the media played a part in giving Ocean Beach a bad reputation?
Yeah, and I think I covered some of that.
So just because they definitely gave it bad media. Okay.
Well, I can try to attempt it again.
Well, I think what you said was good.
Okay.
We need to elaborate more about. Okay. How do you feel about other people, other San Diegans, thinking that Ocean Beach is a bad place?
I don't know why other people think Ocean Beach is a bad place. I've experienced it. My wife has experienced it. A lot of friends have. People find out that you're from OB and they kind of shrivel their nose and frown and look down upon you. But I think part of it is what the media has done to Ocean Beach. But I think still in people's minds is that drugs, hippies, and protests, they can't quite erase that from their mind. But Ocean Beach had a bad reputation even before all that. So it could be a class thing where uptight middle class people look down on a more working class community. I just don't know what it is, but I think it's cultural, it's generational, it's class based. So there's a lot of factors in play there. And I think the media is just played along with that and instead of trying to explain and try to build and develop tolerance in the citizenry, it basically plays off of intolerance.
What do you know about a place called the In-Between?
The In-Between was one of the first kind of alternative social agencies in San Diego. I worked there for a year, and it was established initially as a youth drop-in center on Newport Avenue, OB's main street. And since it's developed into the Ocean Beach Community Services. But when I worked there back in the early mid-'70s, it was mainly a drop-in center for local youth who would come there. It was a place to get away from the street. It was a place to get away from the elements, or a place just to socialize. People could sit there and strum their guitar without being harassed or asked to move on. And then people would get some of their needs met. People with problems and psychological problems or social problems or problems with their parents or problems with society at least felt a little bit of supportive network there.
I've read a lot of the merchants, they didn't like the In-Between, and a lot of the residents didn't like it because the OB rag was given out there, the San Diego Free Press, and some of the other magazines, the Street Journal. Was that true?
It's probably partly true, but it's true that local merchants didn't like the in-between because, again, they saw it as something that was bringing in the poor, the bad elements, and instead it was responding to the needs of some of the youth of the community. But the merchants saw it as attracting the bad elements of the youth to the community, and it's a way of it really depends on how you see the problem, which side of the problem you're looking at, and how you relate to life and people in general. If you think social service agencies just do harm and attract bad elements, then you're going to be against something like the in-between. If you think that you should be helping your fellow man and woman, and particularly those in need, then it was a good thing.
Yeah, like today a place like that is in vogue or whatever. I mean, people like it.
But it's not what it used to be. It's definitely changed.
Okay. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the community planning group?
I don't know. I think I did a lot on that.
Okay, what about...
we could talk about the alternatives, and we talked about that.
What about the group that didn't like the hippies in Ocean Beach and how they went to...
Oh, okay. One of the... every community has its moments, and I think one of Ocean Beach's moments is when the Republicans were planning to bring the 1972 Republican Convention right here to San Diego, and it would have been over here at the convention center, at the sports arena. And Ocean Beach being a very close neighborhood in proximity to the center of this big event, a lot of people in OB started talking to each other about what this would mean to their community. And a number of people throughout San Diego started organizing as early as 1971 to organize protests against the Republicans who would be coming in 72, and saw it as a whole opportunity to raise the issue of the Vietnam War and raise a number of other issues that were pertinent at the time. So at the time, the local OB Town Council president wrote off this hasty letter to the mayor and made it available to the press, damning these protesters and saying we don't want any hippies and protesters and long-haired people coming to Ocean Beach. Well, the very next OB Town Council meeting, a lot of us not stormed the meeting, but were there and in effect made the town council eat some of their words, and basically showed them and the press and the rest of the community that they weren't the spokespeople for all Ocean Beach, and that there were a lot of Ocean Beach people who wanted those kinds of people that referred to in the town council president's letter. Didn't mind people like that coming because they were like that themselves. So it was an interesting time when the town council was vehemently opposed to long-haired hippies, and it was a time when long-haired hippies were organizing themselves to form their own town council. And by the way, I was the first long-haired hippie on the town council, and I was the first OB town council long-haired hippie to be thrown off the OB town council.
Yeah, Mary Ann said that a lot of people were blackballed and they didn't want any hippies on the town council. How could they stop you from getting on the town council?
I was elected to the town council at a meeting, and I was elected by the people who showed up at the meeting. And in the very next meeting or two, they found an old bylaw rule that they seldomly used and brought it out and used it to get rid of me. But I think what it represented was a generational gap, a cultural gap that in some ways still exists throughout the country. But in those days, you have to imagine that it was very sharp, and you were either on one side or on the other. There wasn't a lot of middle mishmash. You either supported and liked hippies and were one yourself, or you were against them and you hated them. You thought they represented evil and everything bad. And I think it showed the schism that existed in the country at the time, when you have a set of established norms and values permeating a country so widely that people just fall over like sheep backing an illegal and immoral war like in Vietnam, or supporting increased police forces and supporting racism. When you have moral values like that running a country, then you're going to have opposition to that, and that opposition crystallized in a number of ways. One way was the hippie movement, the countercultural movement. Another way was in the establishment of such groups as the Black Panthers and the Students for Democratic Society and the Weather Underground, groups like that.
I keep forgetting what I'm going to say. What do you think, okay, things that happened in the late 60s and early 70s, do you think that has made Ocean Beach what it is today? I mean, without those things, would Ocean Beach be a Miami Beach today, or?
I think the mid-70s planning crisis in Ocean Beach was the very strong indicator of where things were going to go, and where they went was that the crisis was resolved so that there wasn't a new Miami Beach, that a lot of people could still reside and live in Ocean Beach. And I think that event, that's the saving of Ocean Beach, paved the way for a lot of what came afterwards. And the level and height of community activism that flourished in the 70s was felt for a whole decade afterwards. I think a different element of the community got involved in the 80s. I think you had more of the business element, who was more hip, or hippified, or surfified, developed, and they took the leadership of the business interests in Ocean Beach and weren't as hard-nosed and against hippies as previous generation had been. And I think they've been running OB since during the 80s. They're responsible for the redevelopment projects. Not that they're bad, just that that it's a different type of person who is active in OB today in the 90s and the 80s than it was in the 70s and the 60s.
What do you think about the revitalization project and the plans for Ocean Beach today?
Well, I think they're hip and groovy and Keno. I'd love to get my tile on Newport, but what does it say for those who are caught up in dead-end jobs and who live in OB? What does it say to single-parent mothers who have problems raising their kids and working at the same time? What does it say to the real problems of OB, which really reflect the problems of San Diego, which reflect the problems of the whole country? How does a revitalization project help the homeless? How does it affect the Mexican farm workers who travel and work in our communities? How does it help peace? Well, people feel better by having nice street lights and tiles, and that's great. But what they do after they start feeling better is, I think, part of the issue too. Do you spend your resources in beautifying a community with the hopes of attracting more investment or more economic financial goals, or do you build programs and develop institutions that literally help all the people? And I don't think the revitalization project is really speaking to that. It's mainly helping the business interests, and in an indirect way helping Ocean Beach. I think people feel more proud of Newport Avenue than they did in the past, and they probably like it to walk down the street now and look at the tiles. And I think it's stabilizing the economic and commercial interests in Ocean Beach, which is ultimately going to be better for the whole community.
Do you have to go?
I think we should probably end it. But do you have one more question? I think we almost lost our light.
We'll just have to,
But for soft and ideal husbands, you can now have what millions